"Lucy, you have no idea how shocked I was when I found out that this artist is blind." The secretary and the accountant chatted to each other all the time during work hours, which made the boss, who was returning from the meeting and noticing this, very angry. After all, he paid his employees well and constantly wrote out bonuses to them. And they were engaged in some incomprehensible chatter instead of working responsibly and completing the tasks assigned to them on time. If they had so much free time, then Chris will certainly figure out what to do with them. When he passed these talkative women, the boss gave them an angry look. But he suddenly saw a photo open on the screen of his secretary's monitor. It was a masterfully painted portrait of a beautiful woman. But the man was struck not by how well it was painted, but by how much this woman looked like his wife. When the secretary finally noticed the presence of the boss, she quickly began to close everything extraneous on the computer, nervously clicking the mouse button, and the accountant quickly ran to her office. Chris wanted to reprimand them, but the portrait attracted so much attention to itself that the man forgot about everything in the world at this moment. How could a blind artist paint a person so beautifully, and not just some person, but his wife? Chris asked the secretary, "Where exactly did you see this portrait? Please don't pretend this conversation didn't happen during work hours. I heard everything with my own ears. Thank God they haven't let me down yet." The secretary blushed all over, but quickly pulled herself together and with great pleasure began to tell the boss that the young artist was painting wonderful pictures, including portraits in the park on the way to their office. The most amazing thing is that he doesn't see anything. He is blind, and how perfectly he depicts such subtle facial features, noticing all the details. The big question is how he manages to draw such beauty. Chris decided to walk around the square at lunchtime and buy the same portrait if the artist was still there. He really wanted to surprise his wife by showing her this masterpiece. He was sure that she would immediately recognize herself. After all, she looked so much like herself in this portrait, as if he had looked at her photo in his youth. Walking through the square, the man saw the artist, around whom people crowded. He immediately understood from the enthusiastic voices that the people gathered admire the work of the blind artist, who surprisingly turned out to be a young guy. And someone even left with a purchased painting. Chris watched the artist from the side for a while, and then he nevertheless decided to approach him. He longed to see the portrait that struck him so. Chris took a look at the paintings and noticed that the shades of colors in landscapes, portraits, and still lifes didn't always match those that he usually sees around him. But on the contrary, this gave the images a special charm, making them a little magical. Chris looked for the very painting for which he came and felt goosebumps run through his skin. Nearby, he saw two more portraits of the same woman. What a resemblance! It was still hard for him to believe that all this was painted by a blind artist. The man cautiously asked the artist, "Do you really see nothing when you paint portraits?" The artist shuddered a little and turned in the direction where the sound of the voice came from. "In fact, I see a lot, but in my head. My fantasy works much better than the eyes that closed some time ago, probably forever." The artist lowered his spectacles a little, and Chris recoiled in horror, because the sight was not pleasant to his eyes. He felt sorry for the guy, but he couldn't help him, even with a strong desire. It's unlikely that doctors could perform a vision restoration surgery, because the guy had no chance. The young man's eyes were covered with a white solid veil. Perhaps only a transplant could help in this case. Surely there are long queues for it, and most likely the price is like half of Chris's fortune. Unpleasant feelings inside him began to grow, so the man bought all the paintings from the guy, paying the artist much more than he asked. And while the young artist did not have time to move away from the shock, feeling the bills again and again and realizing that there was clearly something wrong, Chris quickly walked to his car and drove home, loading his purchases into the back seat. Chris didn't even think to ask the guy who really is that beautiful woman who is depicted in the portraits, hastening to quickly escape from the feeling of his own worthlessness. It was difficult for him to be close to the person whom he wanted to help, but couldn't. Chris began to wait impatiently for his wife to show her the portraits and surprise her with such a strong resemblance. He decided to hang the largest portrait in his office, and he didn't yet know what to do with the other two portraits. Lana returned home in the late evening. She hugged her husband as usual and told him that she was tired of idleness. Chris didn't allow Lana to work, firmly convinced that in the family, the husband should be the main breadwinner. The man didn't spare any money for his wife, paid for her cosmetic services, massage, swimming pool, and various types of training. The couple lost their first child immediately after his birth, and God didn't give them more children. Therefore, they had nowhere to leave their inheritance. Where else would they put their money if not spending it on themselves? The couple traveled quite often and just enjoyed life. Chris offered his wife a couple of times to take a child from an orphanage, realizing that they were unlikely to have a child of their own. It was already too late for her to give birth, and doctors gave disappointing forecasts. But she reacted sharply to her husband's words and said that she was not ready to engage in raising someone else's child. And Chris himself also thought sometimes that, probably, he could not love his baby. After all, something it happens that a man whose parental instinct is not as well developed as a woman's is difficult to accept even his own child. And it will be hard for them to constantly think about their own children, whom they have failed to save. The man helped orphanages financially and made sure that his funds were spent on the merits. Even Lana gladly helped him with this, but they were not ready to take someone else's child, because the pain in their heart remained a bleeding scar after many years and constantly reminded of itself. Honey, I have a surprise for you. Today, I bought a painting from an artist sitting in the park near our office. I felt sorry for him, and this portrait also attracted my attention. Chris showed his wife the same portrait, and she gasped muffledly. This is the spitting image of you, is it not? Chris told her how he saw a photo of this portrait at his work, and then went to the square to personally see the masterpiece, painted by the hand of a blind artist. But the wife just brushed it off and said that this was probably such a marketing ploy. Someone else paints these paintings, and then they deceive everyone by making them look like the work of a poor blind artist in order to sell them for a higher price. But when the husband said that the guy had named a low price for this, the woman thought. Lana murmured, "Why does she look so much like me?" Lana looked at the portraits for several days and couldn't believe the reality of such an amazing resemblance. This beautiful girl from the portraits seemed more and more familiar to her, but at the same time, she didn't recognize herself in her. It seemed to be her, but at the same time she is not. And how does some unknown blind artist know her? Sometimes Lana cried, standing at the portraits, and said that their daughter could be like that. And one day she said to her husband, "Chris, look, the cut of her eyes is like yours. But this is not the main thing. Take a closer look at this speck next to the temple. It looks so much like a mole, like yours." This similarity is not without reason. Chris didn't pay much attention to such details, but Lana's excitement was also transferring to him. Chris saw how the situation worries his wife, so the man decided to bring the guy to his home to personally ask him the questions that drew so much attention to himself. The man asked his wife's driver to bring the blind artist, tempting him with a delicious dinner and a generous reward for the visit. But the driver was afraid that Chris would reprimand him for the failure. He decided to do everything for sure and brought the guy by force. The young man became worried, clutching a palette and a brush to himself. What is this? Why am I here? Why was I forcefully brought here? Chris hastened to reassure the artist and assured him that no one wishes him harm. The man apologized for the behavior of his executive driver and invited the guy to drink tea. The artist introduced himself as Kevin. He turned out to be a very smart and intelligent guy, and at first his voice trembled with excitement and fear. but after a while, he was still able to calm down and relax a little. Suddenly, Chris asked, "Kevin, how do you distinguish colors?" At this time, Lana joined their conversation. The woman put freshly baked buns on the table and looked at the artist carefully. It was a young guy of about 25. They had definitely never met in the past. She would definitely remember him. Lana and Chris listened with interest to Kevin's story. "My girlfriend helps me. She makes special marks on the tube so I don't mix up the colors. She also likes to paint, but now she has to work for two, and I sell my paintings to somehow help her." The guy told them that he was forced to drop out in his second year of college and join the army. It was there that an accident occurred and that deprived him of sight. Margaret turned out to be a devoted and faithful girl. She didn't leave him, becoming his support. Together, they lived in an apartment that Margaret got from the States, since the girl was from an orphanage. After the accident, Margaret was the only person left to support him. Even his parents turned their backs on him and told him to go to his bride, whom they didn't want to accept. "After all, I paint Margaret on my portraits. I remember every feature of her face, and every day, my fingers help me not to forget her beauty. Too bad I won't be able to see her again. Now, only a transplant can help me. But this surgery costs so much money that we can't even dream of earning so much sometime. However, I don't complain about life. Every day I thank God for sending me Margaret. And every day I ask her to leave me so that I'm not a heavy burden for her. I love her and wish her the best. She should be the happiest, even if not with me." Kevin said the last words with undisguised disappointment. Chris frowned. "Are you saying that your girlfriend is in the portraits I bought from you?" "Yes, you are right. True, I don't know how accurately I can vein her features of her face and pick up the colors. Margaret always says everything is perfect. But I know perfectly well that even a sighted person doesn't always manage to perfectly match the shades, and even more so for a blind artist. Therefore, I don't charge a high price for the paintings that I sell. I'm ashamed to ask for a lot of money for something that even I have not seen." Lana asked suddenly, "Excuse me, but how old is your girlfriend?" "She will turn 25 in September." A cup of tea slipped from Lana's hands, and a scream came from her lips. She couldn't believe that this could be, but Kevin named too many coincidences. She exchanged glances with her husband, and they both realized that they were thinking the same thing, and began to ask Kevin to arrange a meeting with Margaret. Lana confessed to the guy that she suspects that Margaret might be her relative, but kept silent about who exactly Margaret might be for her. For a while, the guy doubted and worried, but he couldn't immediately begin to trust strangers who brought him by force to their home. But he agreed, saying that in the meeting, Margaret would come to the square to take him home. You can meet her there if you so desire. The young man hoped that they would not be able to harm Margaret in a crowded place. The guy believed with great difficulty that these strangers could be Margaret's relatives. But where does she have such rich relatives? This strange Chris paid a lot of money for the paintings. Margaret squealed with delight when she saw the money. In the evening, Margaret timidly approached her boyfriend, and Lana and Chris approached her. They were shocked by such a striking resemblance, but far were they too afraid to believe in something. After all, if they believe that this is their daughter, it will hurt them to lose her again. Margaret was of exactly the same opinion when Chris and Lana told her of her suspicions. The girl agreed to take a DNA test, according to which they could find out if it was true that her parents were found in such an unusual way. The results were ready 3 weeks later. Lana and Chris opened the envelope with terrifying trepidation, and both cried when they saw the result. Margaret was indeed their daughter. It was hard for them to believe. They never thought that they were deceived. They considered their daughter dead, and now they didn't understand who they had buried. The scandal with maternity hospital only led to a mistake that day. The head doctor said it was a human factor, and this mistake cost too much for those who mourned their child for a long time. Meanwhile, the girl was sitting at the window in the orphanage and was waiting for her relatives to come for her. As it turned out, That evening, the midwife did not feel well. There were many births, so Margaret was accidentally confused with the girl who was born to some alcoholic woman, whom she refused and who died almost immediately after birth. There was no cue for Margaret because of her poor pedigree, so to speak, and no one wanted to take her away from the orphanage, fearing that her mother's genes would be passed on to her. But the fears were understandably unfounded. The girl grew up strong and healthy, and she was very different in development from her peers, noticeably ahead of them. Chris promised that he would call to account all those responsible from the maternity hospital, and the apology of the head physician had absolutely no meaning for him. After all, he missed the opportunity to see how his daughter grows, how she says her first words, takes her first steps. A couple of weeks later, all the news was talking about this terrible incident, and the head physician was forced to resign. Margaret was glad that she had finally found a family. On the girl's birthday, her father gave her a gift, paying for an expensive surgery for her young man. At first, Margaret was embarrassed to accept such a generous gift, but she understood that it would benefit her lover, and her parents are not to blame for the fact that they were separated for so many years. After the transplant, Kevin slowly regained his sight and began to see, so far vaguely and blurry. But now, he could again admire his beloved and was not afraid for their future. Soon, Kevin made Margaret a marriage proposal and she agreed. Kevin didn't stop painting, although the doctor strongly advised him not to strain his eyes for a long time, because the young man could make a masterpiece even with his eyes closed. His new painting showed a happy mother, father, daughter, and little granddaughter. Finally, the big house of Chris and Lana was filled with sonorous children's laughter when the grandchildren were born. In this way, portraits of a blind artist could change the lives of two families at once.